Hello and welcome to Intro to Biblical Literature, LIR 219 through Frederick Community College. This is your instructor, Logan Isaac. We meet Mondays from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time from October 24th through December 12th. And my phone number is on this slide so that you can see where you can text me if you have any issues. I'm recording this, the first half of the prophecy lecture, because of some family issues that kept me from doing it live on Zoom last Monday. I'm still finishing up the second part of it. It's going to be a little bit briefer. This is going to be the bulk of the presentation, where we talk about what prophecy is in terms of the texts and the people. Another video, I'm doing it to keep it a little bit shorter. Another video will talk about like the nature of prophecy. What is it? That isn't ready yet, but it will be. I want to get you the first video so that we know, so we can have some starting points. Since this is a biblical literature course, we're going to be talking about the texts first, even though you'll see it will be rather counterintuitive. The texts can be either the Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh, which you see here on the right, which calls prophets Nevi'im, broken down into former, latter prophets, and then the 12 scrolls. But as I've said before, this class assumes a Christian lens, not necessarily because it's better, but because it's more prevalent and it's what I'm more expert in. Here we see the NRSV, the Protestant canon of the prophets, not including Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and the rest, but only the prophety prophets, which the Protestants break down into major prophets and minor prophets. And you'll see that Jeremiah is followed by Lamentations because it is believed that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, even though it isn't its own prophetic book in the kind of truest sense. So the Hebrew word for prophet comes from a root related to calling, speaking, or proclaiming. Navi, or prophet, this is the person that is the mouthpiece of God. They don't speak for Yahweh, but they speak on their behalf, on Yahweh's behalf. As you'll recall, one of the names of God is Elohim, which is literally the plural form of El, which is God. So when we say Elohim, the plural singular, the number is actually being deliberately convoluted. It's like saying gods is this or that, using gods as a pronoun, a name, Elohim. Yahweh is God's own self-disclosed name, and it's another popular way of referring to the God of the Hebrew Bible. So as I mentioned before, during this presentation, the first half, we'll be talking about the prophetic texts and the prophetic people, many of which overlap. There are some prophets that wrote their own texts, and there's some texts that claim to be written by prophets, some that are kind of ambiguous, that we might think they are, like Malachi, we'll talk about in a little bit. But there's some overlap, but not always. Some prophets may have written these texts, but most actually probably did not. So, major and minor are the Christian way of referring to the prophets. They are markers of not of significance, as though the major ones are more important, but simply abundance. All 12 minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible fit onto one scroll. And so the Protestants, the Christians, adopted prophetic texts, but reordered them. But the church kept the major-minor distinction in terms of their size, not necessarily their importance. I'll follow the Protestant canon, which excludes the Apocrypha, the intertestamental writings that the Hebrew Bible also kind of doesn't really totally include, but can be considered a part of. The next several slides are going to be coming hard and fast as I talk about the texts and or the people that make up the major and the minor prophets. So as I said, it's going to be hard and fast, so I'm going to encourage you to hold on to your butts and ignore the major-minor distinction. I kind of did that out of order, but oh well. Okay, so the major prophets. Here I've given a breakdown just in terms of size, because again, if we're talking about text, I'm interested in like, what are the size of these books? Are they like, War and Peace by Tolstoy, or are they like The War Prayer by Mark Twain? As you'll see, within the subset of major prophets, Jeremiah is the longest, with Isaiah and Ezekiel being relatively close, and then Daniel being kind of pretty short. And Daniel is almost an intertestamental book. It's not a part of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, but rather kind of this other literature that got attached to the Ketuvim, the writings. But that's just to give you a sense of the major prophets. Ignore the thing on the bottom. It's a typo. So first, we have Isaiah, whose name means Yahweh is salvation. Isaiah ben Amoz began prophesying during King Uzziah's reign and died near the start of Hezekiah's reign, which is in the 8th century BCE. He may have penned the first 39 chapters of the text bearing his name. There are two remaining parts of Isaiah called Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah for 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, which include chapters 41 through 55 and 56 through 66. These two are likely written by disciples who came after Isaiah, the prophet himself, who wrote under his name within his proposed school of thought. And they must have been powerful figures because these extra writings were attached to the book of Isaiah, and they obviously advocated for the prophet and contributed to his prominence. Isaiah, the book, is interested in the destiny of Jerusalem, God's holiness, and care for the poor. It's also one of the heavier cited texts by Christians that the church believes points toward messianic fulfillment of the promises of God. And his artwork, most of these are from the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Some of the minor ones were hard to find, and I'll try and remember to explain the pictures if I can. Jeremiah is the second one in the Christian canon. His name means Yahweh exalts. Jeremiah ben Hilkiah was called to prophesy against Judah in 627 BCE, the 7th century, so a little bit later than Isaiah. At the end, I'll have a chronology. In certain ways, it makes much more sense to go chronologically, but because this is a literature course and we've received the canon, the Christian canon as it is, I'm not going to mess with the ordering, but I will try and outline how these are ordered chronologically. Jeremiah is known for prophesying doom on Judah, the southern kingdom, for their unfaithfulness. And he also insisted that King Zedekiah surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon that will destroy Jerusalem and carry everybody off into exile. Jeremiah tells the king, look, God, this is God's judgment. Don't resist, don't surrender, or don't put up a fight, just surrender, because Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, is the instrument of God's judgment in this case. So he's known as a traitor. His own people turned against him, and he is therefore known as the weeping prophet, because he dies only after witnessing the destruction of Solomon's temple and the exile of prominent families to Babylon. During the Babylonian exile, the Babylonians took all the cool kids, the aristocratic families, the priestly families, and they went off to Babylon. The poorer families on the outskirts of Jerusalem and in and around what used to be the northern kingdom of Israel, they become the Samaritans. They worship Yahweh on a hill that they, to this day, believe was where the temple sat, or the tabernacle sat originally in the temple. And the Samaritans are descended from the poorest of the poor that did not get exiled, who remained in the land, which is this really interesting part of the spiritual history of Israel. Um, he is Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because it's a difficult endeavor. We'll talk about the qualities of prophecy and the vocation of the prophet in the next video, but it's not a fun job to hold. He is known for his confrontations with false prophets in Second Kings or something, I can't remember. He engages with this false prophet Hananiah, and he wears a yoke of wood to show Babylon is going to yoke Israel to it, and you're going to be doing all this labor. Hananiah breaks it in two, and so Jeremiah comes back with a yoke of iron that you cannot break, and that's part of the reason that God is like, okay, you guys want to fuck around, you're going to find out, what I'm capable of. And so this lighter burden, the yoke of wood, has been destroyed, and God's response is, okay, you're going to have 40 years of exile, and the temple is going to be totally destroyed. He also preaches of God's coming new covenant, of softening the hard hearts of his people, and for hope in restoration, that it will not be forever. Next, we have Ezekiel, whose name means Elohim is strong. He's the son of Buzi. He was supposed to be a priest until he was exiled with the Babylonian displacement in his mid-20s. He is a historical figure. We do have pretty strong consensus that the book was probably even written by him in the 6th century. He begins his prophetic vocation in exile to his fellow refugees. So it isn't to Israel or Judah, it's just to the exilic community. After the temple is destroyed, his focus shifts from decrying insolence to inspiring hope. So once all is lost, he turns to encouragement and resurrection of the dead. You might remember his Valley of Dry Bones is from the book of Ezekiel. His prose, his writing style is highly visual, and it is easier to commit to memory. He's interested in ritual and ceremony, the partnership between belief and action, and personal responsibility before God, not just the collective fidelity to the covenant with Yahweh, but that it reaches the individual, that it isn't okay to just say, well, I'm a part of Israel and so I must be just fine. But in fact, even the individual is responsible to the group's collective covenant with the divine. Daniel, finally, the last of the major prophets in the Christian canon, whose name means Elohim is my judge. He may have been a Jerusalem noble, exiled with others to Babylon, just like Ezekiel, but he may also have been a mythic hero used as a foil to personify criticisms against a much later 2nd century Seleucid empire. So I compare it to Jonah. Jonah is written after the Assyrian destruction about, and we'll talk about this in a moment, about Nineveh, which is the Assyrian capital, or the revelation of John, written on the island of Patmos, which is highly visual and stylistic and hyperbolic. Like Revelation, Daniel is also considered an apocalyptic text. Large parts were composed in Aramaic, including chapters 1 through 6, and Hebrew, chapters 1 through 7. We have very old copies that I don't know if they predate the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, the Greek Hebrew Bible, but Daniel does have entire copies preserved that are not in Greek, but rather Aramaic and Hebrew, hinting at its late composition. The Jewish Publication Society Tanakh excludes Daniel from the prophets, the Nevi'im. He is instead put into the other writings, and it's because of this fantastical imagery that Daniel uses, not unlike John's Revelation, to make a veiled point about the powers that be. Daniel is interested in divine revelation and exposing Babylonian oppression. Now, I put a question mark there because he may be this fictitious character, almost like a caricature or a mythic hero, And he may not be, the setting is Babylon. He goes off, he gets put in the lion's den, all that fun stuff. But it may be a morality tale that uses the setting of Babylon to actually say something about the Greek Hellenizing influence of the Seleucid Empire right before the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE. So there's some debate whether Daniel is to be read at its face as a pseudo-historical apocalyptic account of the prophet Daniel in Babylon, or whether it's this even more veiled apocalyptic text about that contains criticisms of the Greekifying, the Hellenizing influence that the Jews were facing just before the period of the New Testament. Because Daniel was written very late. Aramaic was not very popular until the 1st and into the 2nd century BCE. It's the language of Jesus, of most everyday Jews who weren't priests or kind of in the power systems that existed. So Daniel is this really interesting figure and also text that the Christians have put in the prophets, but it may be something more like Jonah or Job, this kind of parody of the powers that be. So moving now into the minor prophets, there are 12 of them, and just as I did with the major prophets, I've included here the different minor prophets as to their size. So Hosea through Joel and all around to Malachi, that's the order. Zechariah, you'll notice, is longer. It's like Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah. It was written very late and has a lot to say about the tradition that it inherited from the 600-700s BCE, but is actually probably written somewhere in the 3rd century BCE. Whereas a lot of the other minor prophets were written leading up to and a few within the Babylonian exile of the 5th century. So the first minor prophet is Hosea, whose name means salvation. He appears to be a person. He's told to take a prostitute, Gomer, for his wife. And this represents God's relationship with Israel. God here is Hosea, and Gomer is Israel. Gomer is a prostitute who, goes off and returns to her old way of life, selling her body for money, for livelihood. They split up and then they reconcile. And they have children whose names are kind of messed up to give to kids, but they reconcile and they have kids. And this is a symbolic, a signal, a sign that hope that Yahweh, just as Hosea takes Gomer back, Yahweh will take Israel back and one day reconcile with God's people. Hosea prophesied to and from the northern kingdom of Israel for 40 years, and he died just before Samaria, the capital city, fell to Assyria. Hosea's text is interested in fidelity to Yahweh and the danger of false worship. The second minor prophet is Joel, whose name means Elohim is Yahweh. You'll notice that Yahweh is typically Jah or Yah, and El is short for Elohim, which just means God, but in the Israelite tradition, Elohim is the name, or one of the names of God. Joel is interesting because there's no firm scholarly consensus as to when it was written. There's no mention of the main culprits like Babylon and Syria, and there's no reference to who sits on what throne, if it's in the north or it's in the south. But what we do get in Joel is this locust plague has been depleting Israel's food supply, and Joel calls this these swarms of locusts an army of God that are supposed to be inspiring Israel to repent and be restored to divine favor. Locusts, of course, are one of the 10 plagues of Exodus, and it's used here again to John will borrow it in Revelation to talk about these creatures, these insect-type creatures that will swarm, and they have like the head of a human, and Anyway, all kinds of weird stuff. But Joel is using uh, uh, an agricultural catastrophe to say God is inspiring us to return to him, to God. And Joel concludes with promises that Judah's enemies, which for Joel are Philistia, Egypt, and Edom, they'll be destroyed. But these are like old Bible enemies: the Philistines, the Egyptians, the Edomites. The Edomites still have some, animosity, or the Israelites have some animosity towards Edom and Edomites closer to the Babylonian exile. But this is like, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, when the Philistines, Philistia, are the enemies. And so Joel might be a very late, or a very old text, but we can't really be sure, because some of the stuff that we usually use to identify a time period, Joel doesn't seem to be interested in or use. What he is interested in, or what the text is interested in, is national lament. Joel wants to remind the people of God's promise of future blessings and the coming judgment of Yahweh's enemies and Israel's oppressors. The next minor prophet is Amos, whose name means burdened. And this image comes from a church in Vienna that you can buy. You can buy this image on Alamy, which I think is kind of messed up, because it's a church image. Like, why are you going to try and make people purchase it? But anyway, Amos is from the southern kingdom of Judah, but he prophesies to the northern kingdom of Israel, and in particular its capital of Samaria. He was active in Bethel, where Jeroboam II, one of the earlier kings of the northern kingdom, had set up an image of a calf for worship. And the temple was obviously the main focus. That's where the Levitical priests operated out of. But there was a number of shrines that sometimes could be used to honor Yahweh, but very often got kind of co-opted into deifying local, entities. The Baals, the Beershebas and Beelzebubs, and all the lesser spiritual beings. So even the kings could screw up and turn some of these shrines into places of false worship. The temple is typically safe from that, but one of the problems when the north and the south split was that the south had the temple in Jerusalem. And so in the north, you have Levitical priests in Kadesh and in other sanctuary cities. If they didn't go down to Jerusalem, they then were left with like, well, what do we do? So they set up shrines and other sites of worship that were often co-opted to false worship. During Amos's time, there's plenty of wealth and prosperity, but underneath, the people were rotten. Amos advocates for the poor and the helpless, and he's one of my favorite writers, which I'll get into, I think, in the second part. Abraham Heschel, who escaped the Holocaust and was a big, very popular and inspiring Jewish theologian in the last century. He actually opens up his book on the prophets with Amos. It's one of his favorite prophets because Amos is really kind of blunt and tells it like it is and doesn't try and make things pretty. He's interested in economic justice in particular, but also divine omnipotence and judgment. The next minor prophet is Obadiah, which means servant of Yahweh. He's one of the few prophets. I think there's two others, Jonah and Nahum. Obadiah is not prophesying to the north or the south. He's actually prophesying to Edom, which was in the southeast of the Dead Sea. And Obadiah was addressing the Edomites because not only were they descendants of Israel, or Jacob, they weren't descendants. Jacob and Esau were Isaac's children. Jacob takes the name Israel, and his older brother Esau, who he cheats out of his own birthright, Esau is the father of the Edomites, and so they lived in the mountain land around Israel, and they had some connection to Israel, but there's one of two moments in which, or both, it's hard to know, but Obadiah basically, he and the other Israelites were upset because the Edomites helped their enemies plunder the temple. And this happened twice, and scholars aren't entirely sure which instance Obadiah is reflecting on. Either in the 9th century with the Assyrians when they plundered the north, and they also kind of came and had some incursions into the south, or in the late 6th century when the Philistines were earlier, in the late 9th century when they plundered the temple. The Assyrians and the Assyrian destruction in 590 could be when Obadiah is referring to as well. The Edomites are kind of opportunists, or according to Obadiah, they are. And when they see the temple being destroyed, they know that riches are in there, so they go and help, the Assyrians or the Philistines, we're not really sure, go through and take all the things of value out of the temple. Their shared lineage from Isaac made this betrayal especially egregious. And so Obadiah is prophesying against Edom's arrogance and saying that they are about to be destroyed for helping either the Philistines or the Syrians. We're not really sure. Jonah is our next minor prophet. Many of you might know him. And Jonah's name means dove, but it's unique in that it doesn't tell of the oracles of a prophet, but it tells a story about a prophet, possibly a man named Jonah, son of Amittai, who is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 14. We're not sure, but it could be. There's this Jonah that the timing might actually work. However, the heavy use of irony makes the dating of the book difficult because the author seems to be writing from a time much later than the setting of the book. The author is aware of details that would not have been known to the Israelites at the proposed dating, right? When the setting of the book itself, it's as though I were writing a book of the Civil War and its history, and writing as someone who was living at that time. But I, of course, know, say, the South will be defeated and slavery will be, dealt a death blow. But at the time, they don't really know it. So within the story, the author seems to be taking the third person omniscient, knows more than the author is disclosing. You may know the story. Jonah is told to preach the destruction of the Assyrians. You may not know it's the Assyrians, but anybody reading at the time would have known that Nineveh is the Assyrian capital. When you say Nineveh, you should think of Washington, D.C. and Americans, just as the ancient Israelites would have thought Nineveh and Assyrians. So there's like this double irony. Anybody who's an Israelite would have been overjoyed to preach the destruction of their enemies. But Jonah doesn't want to. In fact, he goes in the other direction. He gets caught up in the mouth of a whale. It gets spit out. And then he finally does go and preach the destruction of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. And much to his dismay and surprise, the Assyrians repent. They wear sackcloth and ashes. They dump, ash on their head and everything else. And so then he's pissed that his enemies repented and are spared. And so one of the book of Jonah's interests is that Yahweh's persistence is of Yahweh's persistence and willingness to forgive anyone, even the most egregious of enemies like the Assyrians. Next in the minor prophets is the prophet Micah, whose name means humble. It sounds very similar to Michael, whose name means who is of God. Just missing the L part. And Micah is a Judahite and a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos. Micah denounces the rulers, priests, and prophets who do the people no good, and he's especially harsh on exploitative business practices and money hoarding. Micah prophesies that restoration will only come after facing the consequences, including, the restoration will include an even better David to be born in Bethlehem, and messianic prophecy, according to Christians. He is interested in exposing, in particular, sham religion and false prophets. And the image here is from Gustave Doré's illustrated Bible for the the major Bible of Tours. If you want to look up, there's a whole Wikipedia page devoted to all his illustrations. I love Doré. He essentially was like the first comic book artist, the way that he popularizes the stories through art. But anyway, the next minor prophet is Nahum, here depicted by John Tenois. I can't remember, but his 19th century painter. Nahum means comforter, but nothing or next to nothing is known about him. Scholars are divided as to whether he was a survivor of the Assyrian destruction in the north, or if he was a southern nationalist lamenting Samaria's downfall. And I say that because we have some idea of when he was writing, but it was after the Assyrian destruction. And he addresses Israel in a way that doesn't seem to be a stand-in for all of Israel or Judah. It seems to be that he is actually addressing the northern kingdom, but what we know, some of the details that he is aware of, date him after the Assyrian destruction. So it's a really interesting book because he's focused on the Assyrian capital and what happened to the north. But unlike Jonah, who also prophesies against Assyria, unlike Jonah, Nahum suggests that no mercy is due to Israel's enemies. He, in that way, you might agree with Jonah's desire to see their destruction. But Nahum and Jonah are the two prophets who are directing their ire, or God's ire, on Assyria. He's interested in God's wrath against destruction of and woe to Nineveh over and over and over again. It's his primary focus. Next, we have Habakkuk, here depicted in statue form by Donatello. Habakkuk's name means embrace or wrestle. He's maybe from Jerusalem and therefore the southern kingdom, and possibly a Levite. The last chapter of his book uses song, and some scholars have suggested that priests in Solomon's temple were also employed as musicians, so maybe he's kind of drawing on that tradition and narrative kind of foundation. Also, his use of Chaldeans for Babylonians dates his work to the 7th century BCE, so he's a little bit later around the Babylonian exile. And he's really talented with his use of words and language. He stands out as a prophet for openly questioning Yahweh's attention to Israel's sufferings. And this is a callback to Abraham, who argues with God, who doesn't take God at God's word, like, far be it from you that you'll destroy an entire city, meaning Sodom and Gomorrah, just because of a few bad apples. It's not above the Israelite tradition and imagination to argue against God and say, isn't it right that this? Don't you and I know that you are not supposed to be like this? Habakkuk's interests include the righteousness of God and doom to the Chaldeans, also known as Babylon. Next, in the minor prophets, we have Zephaniah, meaning Yahweh hides or Yahweh treasures. This is another image from the Viennese church with, I think it's a mosaic. I don't think it's painted. I think it's tile, but I'm not sure. Zephaniah, son of Cushi, as he introduces himself, could be a reference to dark-skinned Cushites. Some scholars have posed the question of him being a dark-skinned Israelite, because Cushite is one of the stand-ins for northern and eastern African tribes within the Israelite phraseology. He also traces his lineage back to Hezekiah, one of the good kings of Israel, with Josiah and David. And the prophet emphasizes that if Judah is obedient to Yahweh, they'll be spared the worst of Israel's fate at the hands of Assyria. He also uses Genesis language to evoke a kind of uncreation if Judah strays from God. And by that, he talks about being swept away, just like the waters of the deluge. And I can't remember the other linguistic thing he uses, but he definitely evokes Genesis a lot to say that what God does is to uncreate. He's interested, possibly more than most other minor prophets, in the coming day of the Lord. Next, we have Haggai, whose name means festive or solemn. This is another painting by, I cannot remember, Tenoir or something weird. Hagag is festival or feast. And so Haggai means festive, but it can also mean solemn, as in important. He might have been an old man when Cyrus the Persian king sends the Jews back to Jerusalem after defeating Babylon and ending their exile. He prophesied for 3 years. He has a number of oracles in his book. And he was doing so as the temple was starting to get rebuilt, but it had been stalled. And his prophetic activity, helped stir the people to finish the temple by 516, and that becomes the second temple, the temple of Joshua and Zerubbabel. And he is interested in the urgency of restoring God's temple as well as the glory of the worship of God. Next is Zechariah, whose name means Yahweh remembered. Zechariah, son of Berechiah, was from a priestly family, and he helped organize the temple's rebuilding after the Babylonian exile ended. This is one of those books that you saw on the pie chart that was much larger than the rest. Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, who were writing, and then also Zerubbabel, Joshua. They were the people responsible for restoring Israelite traditions after the Babylonian exile. The language and focus shifts after chapter 8, beginning in chapter 9, which scholars believe is likely the product of a disciple or other editor or redactor adding on to what Zechariah possibly had already written himself or had his secretary Baruch write. And he is interested in the judgment and salvation of the whole world, the temple as a sign of God's presence in the world, and how Gentile nations relate to God. Finally, we have Malachi, which means my messenger. Malachi may not be a name because the text, the Hebrew Bible doesn't, assign names. Remember, it's usually in chippets. The first lines of a text are typically its title. But in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, I will send Maliki. And the conjugated word sounds like Malachi. I will send Malachi. And so it may be that later readers added the name, a name, to a pseudonymous text, and it becomes the prophet Malachi. But we don't know that anybody actually existed whose name was Malachi. The prophet's oracles, in general, had not come about, and people were disheartened, leading to casual worship and a distrust in prophecy and prophets. His rebukes are a cry back toward Yahweh, an encouragement to hold fast to hope in the coming day of the Lord. And his interests are reassurance. He wants to encourage people to have faith in liturgy and formal religion, that it isn't entirely corrupt and lost. So finally here, I have a chronology of the prophets with the northern kingdom above and the southern kingdom of Judah below. And I've demarcated Babylon and the Babylonian exile, and then after that, when Cyrus of Persia sends them back and makes the Persian province of Yehuda Medinata, that's essentially like the Judean province before the Romans got there. And the colors of the prophets all correspond to who they are speaking to. If you see a prophet whose name is in all caps, you'll notice Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, those are all major prophets. And the ones in with lowercase letters, those are the minor prophets. And you'll see I have a timeline there at the bottom, or I try to. Notice Obadiah there with a question mark in red. He prophesies against the Edomites, which I haven't included here, who are the descendants of Esau. And I've placed him at the Babylonian exile. That seems to be a little bit where the consensus is going, that it wasn't written when the Philistines plundered the temple with the Assyrians, or plundered the temple. It was when the Assyrians did it. Then you can see Jonah and Nahum are both gray because they're addressing Assyria. And Jonah probably was written much closer to Obadiah's time, but it's set at where I have it here. Daniel in black, he is addressing those in Babylon and the Babylonian oppressors. So I made it black. And Ezekiel is interesting because he's the first prophet to use Israel, quote unquote, to refer to Judah, the southern kingdom, and the Davidic, the house of David, which went through Judah, the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin and Levi, if you count Jerusalem. Judah begins to fade away as a reference point. Now, Israel is going to be returning as a reference to all of Israel. When the kingdom split, the disenchanted, disgruntled tribes to the north said, "Oh, we're the real Israel. We're the kingdom of Israel. We don't have Jerusalem, so we're going to make Samaria our capital." And that left the southern kingdom, southern kingdom and its tribes, the most prominent of which was Judah, which is where we get the word Jew and Jewish. Judah, for a time, it survives longer and is known as Judah, but Ezekiel begins getting rid of that reference point of Judah and saying Israel, which is the remnant in Babylon, the remnant of Israel is Judah. And the tribes of the north are going to be slowly kind of filtered out of the kind of Hebraic lexicon. But these are not all the prophets, just those who wrote books or who had secretaries or disciples who did. There are other prophets in the Bible, including most notably Elijah, Elisha, Huldah, and others. And I will get into that in my next video, but you'll see that Elijah, Elisha were in there, and Huldah, I think, is there just below Zephaniah and Habakkuk. So stay tuned for the second part of this video. I wanted to break this up so that we could focus our questions on the text and the people behind the text before we talk about some of the other prophets that don't have texts and what the actual qualities and characteristics of prophecy per se are.